The Sherlock Holmes Reboot Timeline. This is a little bit different than the main Sherlock Holmes timeline that Frogwares had released because this started with a reboot that it's a soft reboot somewhat. Now, of this new timeline, it's two games to date. The first one being, of course, Sherlock Holmes Chapter 1, and then the second one being Sherlock Holmes The Awakening. So let's start. These were more of an open world exploration type game. Although that was a little bit more difficult to do with the second game. But the main game, the first game, which is Chapter 1, you play as Sherlock Holmes. And this is before he met John Watson. So in this one, he is accompanied by an imaginary friend known as John. Now, this game came out in 2021. It is, quote, described as an origin story. And it was, the premise follows Sherlock Holmes as he turns 21. And just before he really goes, thinks about being a consulting detective. But he is heading back to his childhood home on the Mediterranean island of Cordona. And this is about 10 years after the passing of his mother, and he was basically being raised by his brother Mycroft. Now, to of course limit how far you can go and certain things, they've given Sherlock an aversion to water, which is explained away when you play this game. And you are running around all the various districts. You start in a hotel. And the main story is trying to figure out what exactly happened with his mother. And you go around exploring Cordona, starting off with the hotel, and then going outside and heading to where the old house was, visiting the police. Well, actually, visiting the gravesite, I think, first. Where we also run into an individual that claims to have known Holmes's mother, a gentleman named Werner Vogel, who seems to act as a friend to Sherlock in those times we meet him. Now, we go about Cordona investigating mysteries that somehow link us to, or get us clues to, what happened with Sherlock's mother. These are side cases, so to speak. They're part of the main case of the game because they also use the Mind Palace to help deduce things. And with all these cases, you are going to be asked who you think is responsible, what you think happened, what should be done in the end. This helps shape your character. So this is something that followed on from the seventh and eighth games in the franchise, and all the Sherlock Holmes games. Now, of course, during these cases, you're going to stumble across some other side stuff. Because you're going to need to either purchase or rent costumes to progress in these cases. You will also, depending on the DLC that you add on, because all the DLC works in with this game, you will have other cases that may take your attention. And they're wonderful distractions, if you ask me. But, Sherlock is trying to find out what the truth behind what really happened with his mother. And what we find out is, well, through these cases, we learn some things. We unlock areas of the house that give us more clues onto what happened to piece together. I mean, the first case, well, our first actual case in the game involves trying to find out what happened regarding a diamond, a missing diamond, that went missing during a medium seance. And what we find out is that the wife of the husband, the one who she said who claims the diamond was stolen, she actually quote pilfered it and claimed that the person doing the seance did, because it's someone she knew from her days running in a gang in Cordona. And so, literally, you know, once you find out the truth, you are allowed to make a choice on what to do. Do you, one, you basically reveal the truth to the husband, who isn't necessarily the best of men? Do you make it look like he stole the diamond? You make it look like the other guy stole the diamond, who could have actually done it, but he's been trying to get out of the crime business. So you want to give him a chance to get away. Those choices matter. But after that, you head off to the graveyard, visit the mother's grave, meet Werner Vogel, and go to start looking into what happened with your mother. Which is at means you have to go to the police station there in Cordona, and they're a little short-staffed. In fact, they're short-staffed since the Grand Inspector either died or left the position. Well, it looks like he's dead, but he left. He staged his death. And this is what you discover by, first, you have to become a police officer, go through the process, and then solve all the cases to help the one guy. It ends up helping the one guy get promoted, but he wants an answer to this case too. Which, this is when you find out that the guy actually killed the leader of the gang, took on his identity, and has been disbanding the gang from the inside. Which is kind of a clever way of doing it, and besides, he can, quote, retire in peace, as he looked at it. Can't blame the guy. Really can't. Then he heads off, But those are all things you discover as you do the police cases. But Sherlock is now looking into things, and a nearby home of an old friend, you go there to find out that he has been apparently killed by his pet elephant. The question is, was it an accident? Was it murder? There are various things that you have to check out to determine if it was one or the other. Could it be the daughter? Could it be her lover? Could it be someone who's angry with him because he is holding up an archaeological dig or trying to force one closed? That's all things you investigate. Of course, your investigations turn out some interesting details, like the girl's lover is not all that he seems. Oh, let's face it, he's a she. In a time where women in a men's, a woman doing what was considered a man's job was, wrong. And an affair between two women is wrong. Frowned upon. These games open up saying that they take place in a time where racism and this was very prevalent. And let's face it, it's something that should be included in a period piece like this. Because that is the way the world was. And some places still is. Well, Sherlock solves that case. I mean, what it turns out to be was the elephant. Well, the elephant did do the deed, but it was stupidity on the man's part for not understanding things. We then move on to quote what would be the next case in the game, in which Werner Vogel asks us to look into the disappearance of a painting. Starts out simple enough, but becomes increasingly more complex. Because it involves a very person high up in Cordona politics being blackmailed. Because the picture has him and the painting features him and the proof that he got one of the refugees pregnant through very, questionable actions. This means that we now must make a decision on what to do. Because the person who was trying to do the blackmailing and who stole the painting or was linked to the stealing of the painting got killed. And so, we now have to prove it. We have to get the images to the person who should truly be put in the right place to do something. We have to bring this fact to justice, but we have to do it in the right way. And while Sherlock has never been one to... Sherlock agrees of bringing a truth to light if it does more good than harm. I mean, in the case of one of the stories in which we saw an adaptation in one of these games of the case of Black Peter. I mean, the man that was killed was a rapscallion, was doing, or one of those cases, but the guilty party didn't intend for the death to happen, and it ended up being more of a self-defense type thing or something like that. So, as it plays out, Holmes and Watson basically allow him to escape and give up a plausible excuse for the other possible candidate for the crime to, you know, be left alone. That kind of thing. And that's the case with this blackmailing thing. While there is a local mob person or a local criminal crime lord who would gladly take this and use it to his advantage and give the person possibly the best possible outcome for the victim, but not necessarily the best outcome for the refugees, you have to do what is right. I mean, deposing the person might lead to someone worse getting in there and a whole dismantling of the system. And as if you give the information to Werner so he can publish it. You have to do what's best for all, or best for the many and not the few. It's a tricky question that you have to ask yourself. And yeah, you could take it one route, you could take it another route. It all depends. And of course, there's a third case that gives you your last bit of information, where you are invited, called to a club or a get together, that is, not necessarily would be smiled upon by the the establishment, where people can indulge in drugs and illicit sex and all that. You are invited there because a murder has happened. And so you must try and figure out a solution to things, in which you must question people and try and solve what has happened. This is the last case in the game that gives you your last clue to basically uncover the ending. Now, of course, as you, of course, go through the case, you find that a young man's been killed. The three possible suspects, even though it looks like Werner did it, is the man who ran the party, his major domo, or a woman that was at the party that is in, to help entertain the guests. When all is said and done, it all looks like this guy was the guy who ran the party was the one behind it. It was done out of a jealous rage that he didn't want to be, that the victim didn't want to be his boy toy anymore. And apparently he was doing this before the guy became of age. So, ugh. This is also when we start now finally getting information to put all together. I mean, for all throughout the main story, you've been getting hints that a doctor was treating Violet, that's Holmes's mother, for, well, let's face it, she was going through PTSD because of the death of her husband. And the treatment was not necessarily helping her. It probably was doing as much as hurting her. Mind you, in the same time, every time a doctor makes a mistake, it's also a learning thing because we learn new things about these diseases. Trust me, all the diseases we know now that have not come about in the recent years, we learned about because mistakes were made. Is it sad that the mistakes were made? Yes. Is it sad that those people died? Yes. But we learned from the mistakes. A death 500 years ago prevents billions now. That kind of that kind of mentality. But of course, Mycroft was not necessarily happy with this. This is also how we learn how much of a, quote, bigger manipulator Mycroft is. While Sherlock limits his to the inner level, the crime level, Mycroft looks at the bigger picture, the world level. Sherlock brought a criminal to justice. Good for him. Unfortunately, now it's caused this guy to move in here, making him stronger. And we needed this guy to be committing these crimes here because he was doing them for us. That kind of thing. So, Mycroft had basically put the blame for his mother's death, even though it was quite justified because she almost drowned Sherlock as a kid when he was younger, which Sherlock had basically blocked out of his life, and was also why, in turn, he was coming up with his friend John, who was imaginary. You get your hints at this when you use your instinct vision and all that, and while other characters, until you focus on them, sort of remain in somewhat of a outline sense, John is always full color. John also helps you decide, helps by walking around to the spots while you focus at recreating the events in your mind and, snapping things into place. He also comes up with challenges when you're solving cases, like with the side stories. Hey, Sherry, wouldn't it be neat if you stayed as a cop all this time? Hey, Sherry, this blind duel club has these rules. Why don't you follow them? That kind of stuff. He's also critical if you end up asking too many people information they can't answer. Of course, what also adds to this game's fun factor is the DLC and the side cases. Most of the side cases are there are some that are programmed in there, like side stories for Cordona. But then there's some that you can get through DLC. One of which, the other M, is where you discover somebody is onto, Mycroft stuff. and is putting a thorn in his plans. There's obviously a hint to this early, when you start looking around, if you got the content, that this person is James Moriarty. It is where we get set up that our first ever encounter with Moriarty, but Sherlock does not know who Moriarty is yet. But Moriarty sees a worthy foe in Holmes. I think through all extended media, it's always shown that Moriarty has a respect for Holmes, and while he would like to bring Holmes down, he could also be the only person Moriarty would trust with something delicate, because Holmes is his mental equal. We also get a link to Sherlock Holmes meeting Arsène Lupin, because in one of the other add-on DLC cases, you see him going after a magician is being sort of blamed for thefts. But every time the crime happened, it was during a time when the magician was performing. So it had to be someone who knew the trick and capitalized on that. And what we find out is that it was Arsène Lupin who was, again, using a woman who was posing as a man, because to get ahead. And it also plays a little nod because there was a story, but the estate of Arthur Conan Doyle would not allow it. And so it was changed to Hemlock Sholmes. So to hear him saying that is a very nice little nod there. And there are other side cases that are one that links to how Sherlock gets to the violin. Missing coins and cases for Mycroft. A treasure hunt to help you build up, and refurnishing the house to unlock memories and that. It's a beautiful thing. It really added to that game. And of course, then we find out, and Werner Vogel was actually the brother of the doctor that Mycroft, that doctor that was treating Violet and that Mycroft had put away. And of course, the game ends with a scene that beautifully recreated from A Study in Scarlet. And then we move on to The Awakened, which is a beautiful remake, and this was very nicely done. And it still has that open world where you're going through the main story, using the Mind Palace to help unlock moving on, and adding side cases. Now, while the areas are relatively smaller, you still have to look around for these clues. You get actually points for looking forward and unlocking nice little additions. If you explore everything, there's a total of 1,500 points for stuff to unlock. And as The Awakened is a very Lovecraftian style game, all the unlocks are related to stories in that Lovecraft had written. But of course, it all revolves around the plot to basically turn the world over to the old ones, where a representative of every nation in the world must give over the land to Cthulhu. And it's being done at a lighthouse. And you don't know who the mastermind, but you get clues that lead you to certain locations that have a link in this. I mean, a manservant, a Maori, it goes missing, which leads us into this. And so we find clues that say he was abducted and taken to the docks. So we go to the docks and we find out people are going missing there too. And we find the right where they're all being taken to, and we find a temple to Cthulhu there. And we also have something that's new by Sherlock going into this other world, solving puzzles, very cleverly put puzzles. An invisible bridge, lighting up sigils by walking into swinging blades that are right by the sigils. All sorts of things. Of course, the investigation there leads us to an asylum in Switzerland. And of course, because this is a new timeline, they changed certain things. Like in the main timeline, that that asylum is where you find Moriarty. And in fact, to escape, Sherlock releases Moriarty. Because this takes place after the whole final problem in the Reichenbach Falls. After that, of course, we are off to New Orleans. And of course, we find, of course, because we have a clue there that we found there at the asylum, which turns out that, of course, you got a corrupt sheriff, and that the person that had these quote opals to sell, well, they didn't necessarily sell them. It was their quote friend who did it, and basically commit a crime to almost killing the man and taking him to a temple site that is in the bayou. Of course, you go off there, find him, bring him back, which puts a kink in that part of the plan. I mean, the asylum has also been taken out due to the events, always putting a hindrance to those that are in the plan, and eventually returning back to England to try and determine what's going on with this book, why this book and all that, where we find out, that's also where we found out that this is a dark ritual that could bring about basically as everybody likes to call it, the apocalypse. And so, and we get information from Mycroft, this time on the condition that Sherlock Holmes not be told that was from Mycroft. Sherlock does not necessarily like to rely on Mycroft, and his relationship with Mycroft was also a little bit strained due to the events in Cordona. And of course, as everything plays out, you go to the lighthouse, sneak into the lighthouse, work your way up to the top of the lighthouse to stop the ritual while people are sort of milling about for their time to jump to their death, giving over their country to, you know. So this is where things really take place because as Sherlock's talking with the man, you now have a reference that this man's been aware of the other timeline. That he's done this multiple times and has failed each time. But things were changed differently. Now, of course, this game does still have the open world setup. And while it's a little bit similar, you also have some side cases that allow you to look into other things. Not as many as in Chapter 1, because let's face it, you're a little bit more limited and you can't double back to areas, usually. I mean, the first chapter, you have a sad story about what happened to some children. In the second chapter, you have what appears to be a haunted warehouse and the shantytown being poisoned. In your third one, you're finding out about deaths that happened at the asylum. And trying to find out what happened. And in your fourth chapter, where you're in New Orleans, you are, finding about something that happened to somebody with a guilty conscience, and Sherlock is collecting wanted posters for his own collection. But the second one changes some things up because, I mean, they eliminated certain things that were in the original, like a mad dash to catch someone who stole your papers. That doesn't happen in the remake. Of course, Moriarty doesn't show up in this remake. You have changes to individuals, like Dr. Gygax, as I now believe went from male to female. And although she's a cold, evil bitch, you have someone else that breaks free. It's a very nicely done game, and to alleviate the tensions of open world, because you're now dealing with smaller areas, they have something in play that when you're going to leave a chapter, they let you know that, do you wish to do this? This is actually what they did at the end of the game of Chapter 1, because once you enact on that final part, there's no going back. The game's over. You can't explore any cases you missed and all that. So, if there's cases that you can only access while you're in a certain area, you have to do them then. So at the end of every chapter in this game, in The Awaken, they let you know that you can't go back. The same thing when you enter the end game in the last game. You can't go back. There's only going forward. And if you screw up somewhere there, you get the chance to fix your mistake. Which is a little bit beautiful because instead of, just doing one lens and like in the original, now you got to do four. So you have to figure that one out. Which four are you going at? How do you stop them? How do you break them? And meanwhile, Sherlock is talking with the leader of the cult, and Watson's doing the breaking of the lenses. Whereas in the first one, Watson was the original. He was just trying to stop the people from jumping off. Now, of course, there was some difficulty in some of this stuff because of the war in Ukraine, and that Frogwares' development studio is in Ukraine. But this is a very good game. This is a game a franchise everyone should play, in my book. Especially if you like the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. It changes the narrative. It makes you wonder what are they going to do for the next one because now they've changed so much of the timeline. I mean, at the end of The Awakened, Watson is has typed up this story, and even Holmes, who's having a rough time recovering from this, says this story is going to make you lose readers. This story is going to make you sound like a blithering fool. Best to, now that you've typed it down, but destroy it. That kind of thinking. These were two very good games. They utilized open world very well. And while The Awaken is much shorter than Chapter 1, this is because of how it was designed. I mean, when you have a vast area where you can go to and from, you can't necessarily do it right away, and that's what they have to do. They gotta stop it. But it's a good game. It's very fun to play. These were both good games. I'd like to see more of these games, and I hope they do make more. Because this changed the timeline with the new style and all that. It's worth it. And two games came out basically in a 2 year time frame. 2021 is when Chapter 1 was fully released. 2023 was when The Awakened was released. I would recommend getting the whole games and getting the DLC because it just adds so much to these titles. And I do hope they make more of these games because they are beautifully done. And that's all I'm going to say regarding these games. I do recommend you getting them. I hope you enjoyed listening to me go on about these. And until next time, I would like you all to take care and have fun. Bye all.